There comes a time in every nation's journey when silence becomes betrayal, when continuing the old agreements becomes a slow form of national suicide. For decades, India danced on the tightrope of Western diplomacy, playing by rules it did not write, bending to frameworks it did not design, and bearing consequences for decisions it never fully owned. That era is over. India did not rage, didn't riot. India simply walked away, quietly, powerfully. Finally, ending trade with America is not an act of hostility. It is an act of maturity. A mature civilization knows when an alliance turns into a leash. India has been fed for too long on the promise of globalization that always seemed to benefit the West more than it empowered the East. Our industries remained subordinate, our markets vulnerable, our policies constantly judged through foreign metrics. But the final insult wasn't in numbers. It was in tone. The arrogance, the lectures, the moral superiority dressed as diplomacy. Washington whispered policies into Delhi's ears if India were a pupil in some global classroom. But no more. The student has not only graduated, he has become the teacher of his own course. This break was inevitable because dependency is a slow poison. America offered aid with conditions, alliances with caveats, and access with strings so long they wrapped around our neck. We were told to open our markets, but theirs remained protected. We were told to adopt their values while they disregarded ours. We were made to feel that without them we would collapse. But here's the truth: India has stood for 5,000 years without America and will thrive without it again. The so-called free trade was never truly free. It was transactional exploitation masked as partnership. We exported raw talent and they imported influence. We gave them code, culture, cooperation. And in return, we were handed policies that undermined our self-reliance. When India tried to assert herself, sanctions followed. When India wanted to buy oil on her own terms, threats followed. When India questioned the West's double standards, silence followed. What kind of partnership is built on obedience? What kind of friendship demands submission? Walking away from America economically is not a divorce. It's a detox. It is India saying, we no longer want to grow at the cost of our independence. It is the rebirth of economic Swaraj, not just from colonial rule, but from neo-colonial economics. The spirit of 1947 now lives in the policies of 2025. It's not just about trade, it's about terms. And India is rewriting those terms, alone, if it must. This move is not about aligning with new masters. It's about becoming a master of one's own fate. Russia and China may be new partners, but India joins them not as a follower, but as a formidable equal. Because this time we are not choosing a side, we are choosing ourselves. Let the world misunderstand, misquote, or malign this decision. Let the West pretend to be shocked, because that's what empires do when they realize the world no longer revolves around them. But India is not concerned with the shockwaves it sends. It is focused on the roots it strengthens. And nothing roots a nation deeper than the power to say, no more. We are not chasing power, reclaiming dignity. We are not rejecting friendship. We are rejecting manipulation. And above all, we are not isolating ourselves. We are finally liberating ourselves. This is not the end of a trade deal. It's the beginning of sovereign intent. Every empire has its moment of realization, a sudden, shocking awareness that the world has changed and it was too arrogant to notice. That moment has arrived, but it didn't explode with bombs or blare through headlines. It happened quietly in corridors of power and midnight phone calls. India is turning not as a victim fleeing from betrayal, but as a sovereign walking toward opportunity. And now it is Russia and China that form the new axis of India's strategic alignment. To the West, this is seen as betrayal, but in reality, it's balance, because for too long, India was asked to carry the burden of Western expectations while getting crumbs in return. We were supposed to be the democratic counterweight to China, the strategic puppet in Asia. But India was never anyone's pawn. And what they failed to see, what they refused to see, is that this civilization, this culture, this consciousness was never built to follow. We were built to navigate. Strategic alignment with Russia is not a gamble. It's a return to loyalty, to mutual respect forged in fire. While America sold India slogans, Russia offered us steel, technology, defense, and dignity. Without the endless lectures, the West placed conditions. Russia placed trust. The alliance was never loud, never theatrical. It was steady, patient, and most of all, respectful. In times when India stood alone, Russia didn't turn its back. And now, as India stands stronger than ever, it is only natural that it turns toward the partner that stood beside it when it had little. And then there's China, the most misunderstood piece on this geopolitical chessboard. Yes, there is rivalry. Yes, there is tension, but realpolitik is not about affection. It's about necessity. It's about choosing strength over sentiment. India doesn't need to become China's friend. It needs to become China's equal. And that doesn't happen through distance. It happens through direct strategic proximity. A trilateral understanding between India, Russia, and China is not about ideology. It's about leverage, the kind of leverage India never had when it was cornered into Western frameworks. With this triangle, India gains access to energy corridors, massive manufacturing pipelines, advanced defense ecosystems, and a voice in shaping the future architecture of the multipolar world. The West fears this not because it's immoral, but because it's effective. For the first time in modern history, India is not reacting to the world. It is repositioning it. A Eurasian alliance disrupts every single prediction made by Western think tanks. It collapses the fantasy of a unipolar order. It dismantles the illusion that democracy must wear a Western suit to be valid. And above all, it terrifies those who built empires on the backs of division, because now unity is forming without them. To those who ask, can India trust Russia or China? The question is misdirected. India no longer builds its foreign policy on trust alone. It builds it on interest. And right now, those interests align with the East, not the West. This move is not without risk. But what is more dangerous, turning toward a competitive alliance with shared ambitions, or continuing to cling to a decaying transatlantic promise with diminishing returns? India has chosen the former, because empires do not rise on nostalgia. They rise on adaptation. India is not aligning East to abandon the West. India is aligning East to become unalienable, to become a force so self-reliant, so indispensable, that alliances are a choice, not a crutch. This is the strategic realignment the world never predicted, because it assumes India will always play catch up. But now India isn't chasing the game. India is rewriting the rules. Trust, once broken, doesn't explode. It erodes quietly, slowly, like a drip wearing down stone. And for India, trust in the West, especially in America, has been eroding for decades, masked under fancy words like strategic partnership, shared values, and mutual interests. But beneath the slogans lay a truth too bitter to ignoring. The West never saw India as an equal, only as a tool, and no self-respecting nation can afford to trust a partner that treats cooperation like control. America spoke of democracy, yet armed nations that threatened India's sovereignty. America promised trade, yet punished India for acting in its own economic interest. It claimed moral high ground, yet applied double standards without shame. When India refused to cut ties with Russia, the West responded not with understanding, but with veiled threats. When India pursued discounted oil, it wasn't congratulated for economic prudence. It was scolded like a child stepping out of line. These weren't signs of alliance. They were signs of arrogance. What began as posturing turned into policy. The so-called Indo-Pacific strategy had less to do with India and more to do with using India as a counterweight to China, a buffer, a pawn, a pressure valve. And when that didn't work, the tone changed. Western media began to paint India with suspicion, questioning its democracy, doubting its integrity, undermining its decisions. The West couldn't tolerate that India would not play its designated role. America wanted India close, but only on its terms. It offered technology, but restricted critical access. It offered military cooperation, but always under surveillance. It offered platforms, but demanded narratives. The trust India placed in the partnership was met with constant tests, constant suspicion, and constant reminders that it was still the junior partner in the room. This wasn't trust. It was transactional convenience. And India, having witnessed centuries of colonization, recognizes that smile too well, the one that flatters just before it exploits. India Luciferias. History has taught it that foreign friendships are only as good as their respect for sovereignty. And that respect was slowly dying in Washington boardrooms and Brussels summits. It's not that India seeks conflict with the West. It simply no longer needs to pretend. It no longer needs to ask for permission to survive. When America pushed sanctions, India pushed back with silence. When Western institutions criticized internal policies, India didn't scramble to explain. It stood firm. Because the new India doesn't negotiate its identity to fit global templates. It defines the template. The final nail in the coffin of Western trust wasn't a single incident. It was a pattern of unreliability, of hypocrisy, of using India as a diplomatic chess piece without ever letting it sit at the real table. And now that India has found its voice, the West feels threatened, not because India is dangerous, but India is finally independent. You don't need to scream to make a point. Sometimes walking away is the loudest thing you can do. India's decision to pivot is not a tantrum. It's a lesson that trust must be earned, not demanded, that mutual respect must be consistent, not conditional, and that a true partner does not lecture you in public while shaking your hand in private. The West had its chance, decades of it, and it chose dominance over dialogue, over partnership, and fear over faith. India saw it, endured it, outdrew it, and now it is done pretending, because once trust is broken, you don't go back. You move forward with clearer eyes, with firmer steps, and with the unshakable clarity that the future cannot be built on a foundation of betrayal. This is not just a geopolitical pivot. This is the emotional severing of false alliances. And in that severing, India has found its strength, the world we've known for the last 75 years, where one power dictated, one culture dominated, and one narrative reigned supreme, is crumbling not with explosions, not with invasions, but with intelligence, independence, and intention. That's how empires fall, not in a moment, but in the silence that follows when others stop listening. And India's recent pivot toward Russia and China is not just a trade move. It is a signal that a new power center is emerging, and it's not in Washington. Unipolarity is a fantasy built on fear, a belief that one country could forever control the levers of global economy, diplomacy, military, and culture. That fantasy worked when others were weak, divided, or desperate. But that world is gone. What is rising in its place is not chaos, but correction, a correction of power, of voice, of dignity, and at the center of that correction stands a triangle. India, Russia, and China, three civilizations with scars deep enough to remember colonialism and strength great enough to refuse it ever again. This triad is not bound by ideology. It is forged by necessity. Each of these nations has faced humiliation at the hands of Western dominance. Each has been sanctioned, threatened, lectured, or underestimated. But now, together, they represent something the West never prepared for, an alliance that doesn't ask for permission. India brings demographic might, digital innovation, and spiritual depth. Russia brings natural resources, defense expertise, and historical resilience. China brings manufacturing scale, financial infrastructure, and geopolitical strategy. Alone, each is formidable. Together, they are uncontainable. This triad doesn't mimic the West. It reinvents power without colonization, without occupation, without puppetry. This is not about revenge. It's about rebalancing. For too long, global institutions served one master. The IMF, the World Bank, the UN, used as tools not of justice, but of pressure. But now new platforms are rising, BRICS, SCO, and bilateral corridors that bypass Western banking systems, that settle in national currencies, that build without debt traps. The new world isn't being debated in the halls of Harvard. It's being constructed in the railways of Siberia, the ports of Gwadar, the fintech labs of Bangalore. What terrifies the West isn't just the economic cooperation between these nations, it's the philosophical realignment. A world where development is not predicated on Western approval. A world where human right just a weapon used selectively. A world where sovereignty isn't sacrificed in the name of globalism. This isn't just the East rising, it's the East remembering who it was before it was colonized, remembering how to lead without conquest, remembering that dignity doesn't need validation, it only needs vision. India's choice to step away from the lean into this triad isn't a betrayal of the past. It's a bet on the future, a future where no one culture defines progress, where no single nation polices the world, where power is shared and not imposed. This is not just strategy, and this is survival, and this is what the West fears most, that their monopoly is not being challenged. It's being outgrown. What we're witnessing is not a political experiment. It is a civilizational reawakening, a merger of memory and ambition, A quiet but seismic refusal to be told who can lead and who must follow. This is India finally stepping onto the global stage, not as a supporter, but as an architect. The unipolar world is not collapsing in chaos. It's dissolving in irrelevance. And what's taking its place is more ancient, more balanced, and far more dangerous to outdated empires. Because when the East unites not just with hands, but with hearts and minds, the world doesn't shift, it transforms. Power doesn't begin in weapons or wealth. It begins in belief in how a nation sees itself, in whether it bows before others to feel relevant, or stands tall regardless of applause. And for decades, India sought validation from the West, in economic rankings, in diplomatic praise, in acceptance by institutions that were never built with India in mind. But something has changed, not on paper, but in the psyche of 1 billion people. India is no longer asking, will they accept us? India is asking, do we accept ourselves? This psychological shift is the most revolutionary move of all, not because it's loud, but because it's permanent. The chains of colonialism are no longer physical. They are mental. The inferiority complex that said Western suits are smarter than Indian kurtas, that Western degrees are wiser than Indian philosophy, that Western partnerships are the only path to success, that lie lived deep in India's subconscious for too long. But now that lie is dead. India no longer begs for a seat at their table. It builds its own. And if they don't come, India eats alone, because the country has realized validation is a trap. It's how empires keep others obedient. They offer praise like candy, as long as you follow their rules. But the moment you think for yourself, you're labeled as aggressive, authoritarian, unpredictable. India has heard all these labels before. And for the first time, it doesn't care. That's the real power shift, not in diplomacy, not in trade, but in the soul. This is the moment when the colonized mind dies and the awakened mind rises. The truth is, India was never behind. It was simply being gaslighted, told that it was too chaotic to govern, too spiritual to lead, too fragmented to unite. But now India knows its diversity is not its weakness. It's its weapon. Its ancient texts are not relics. They're strategic frameworks. Its civilization isn't outdated. It's untamed. And most importantly, India doesn't need to be Western to be modern. It can be Indian and infinite. This psychological independence is what makes the West most uncomfortable, because a nation that no longer looks up to you cannot be controlled. And a nation that looks within for direction becomes self-correcting, self-renewing, and self-defining. You can't colonize a mind that has remembered its own worth. And make no mistake, this isn't nationalism. This is clarity. Nationalism seeks enemies. Clarity seeks alignment. India isn't trying to isolate itself from the West. It's just refusing to shrink itself to fit within its outdated frames. India isn't turning its back on the world. It's just turning toward a mirror and seeing, finally, the full stature of its own reflection. When you stop needing their praise, their threats lose meaning. When you stop chasing their models, your originality returns. And when you stop fearing their judgment, you start creating your own legacy. This is where India stands today, not defiant, not dependent, but detached. It will work with those who respect it. It will resist those who manipulate it. And it will no longer be triggered by who applauds or who doesn't. This is not just a political shift. It is a cultural correction, a civilizational recalibration. The rising India is not a new country. It is an old soul finally waking up from centuries of sleep. And now it walks, not to chase the world, but to shape it. So let the West watch, wonder, criticize, or copy. It doesn't matter anymore, because when 1 billion minds wake up to their own power, nothing and no one can put them back to sleep.